I'm sitting on the sofa, looking into the soft glow of the fireplace, a glass of eggnog in my hand. It's Christmas Eve, and in the background, I can hear my wife humming a carol in harmony with the gentle tunes coming from the stereo as she sets out the Santa Claus gifts. Even though our children are all but grown now, we still have Santa on Christmas morning. Only instead of dolls and toys, the gifts are sweaters and dresses, movies and CDs, all given with the love they have come to expect from us. I look over at her, and as it happens so often, she looks back at the same moment. Our eyes lock, and we smile at each other, sharing a look of everlasting love. I think back to an earlier Christmas Eve many years ago, and to one 2 years before that, when a series of fortunate and unfortunate circumstances led Grace to become my partner, and soon thereafter my wife. They say you sometimes have to go through hell to get to heaven. And that was true in my case. I went through a hell that I wouldn't wish on any man. But if I hadn't, I wouldn't have Grace, and I wouldn't be half the man I am today. Let me tell you my story, because there are some lessons to be learned from it. To the best of my knowledge, in the history of the world, there has only been one perfect man, and even he was quite a bit more than just a man. So it stands to reason that every one of us, at some point in our lives, has done something bad, something that hurts someone else. We've all done something that should have earned us condemnation, at least from the higher powers. It is because of grace that we don't pay the penalty for our often foolish decisions. In my case, I took someone who was straight, or at least not involved with substances, and started her on the path to addiction. I introduced Elise Tucker to marijuana when we were just out of high school, and from that one corrupting moment, she slowly descended into a darker world. It might not have been so bad, except that not long after that, I got her pregnant, we got married, and she eventually gave me 3 children in the space of 4 years, 2 daughters and a son. It wasn't until we had been married almost 8 years that I realized what she had become behind my back, and it took most of my money and all of my self-respect before I was finally free of her. Even then, she left me with scars, both physical and emotional, that I still carry today. My name is Steve Moreland, and I'm 42, far wiser than I was when I was 15. I was born and raised in a suburban area near a mid-sized southern city. My folks were fairly well off, and I did my best to be cool. Although I was on the football team all through high school, I didn't play much, mostly on special teams and junior varsity. That never stopped me from smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, or using marijuana. That's just the way it was in those days. You'd think that when a good friend of mine was killed during my senior year of high school, it would have set me straight, and in my case, it did for a while. I was on the rebound from that incident when I began dating Elise. We had a class together, and she sort of latched onto me as someone who was in need. Never mind that she already had a boyfriend, a fellow a year older who was attending the nearby junior college. We started dating, and soon she left him for me. That should have been a warning, but I was so smitten that I failed to notice. At that time, Elise was somewhat of a band nerd, but she was the kind who was very open about her affection. She was a little taller than average and fairly attractive, with a figure that was quite pleasing. She was always a bit self-conscious about her nose, which had a slight quirk to it, but that in no way hurt her looks. She had soft brown hair that was utterly unremarkable. For the most part, she was a nice girl, the youngest child of a truck driver and a school teacher. But there were a few folks who didn't like her much, one of whom was my father. Even before she got mixed up in drugs, Elise could be moody at times, and when she was in a bad mood, she could be quite difficult. But that was okay, because when I was in a bad mood, I could be pretty foul too. Even my mom, who liked her and empathized with her, recognized the pitfalls of 2 people like us getting together. I also think my dad sensed that there were demons lurking in her soul that could devour me if they were unleashed. Plus, he thought I could do a lot better. But I was in love, and besides, he'd supposedly married beneath his station as well, and my mother turned out to be a truly remarkable person. The relationship might have run its course if I hadn't gone to college and returned for Thanksgiving break with a renewed appreciation for the wonders of weed. The first day I was back from college was a Tuesday morning. Elise's parents were working, and she met me at the door still dressed in her thin nightgown. We hadn't been together in a couple of months, and we were feeling a strong attraction to each other. I talked her into putting on some clothes and taking a ride with me. We had a great parking spot we had used before, so I drove us there. Once parked, I pulled out a fat joint. She looked at me with a hint of disapproval, but I could tell she was curious about it based on how I talked about it in roundabout terms. So she agreed to try it. She became really giggly, and then she turned to me with a passion I hadn't seen in her before. I mean, we had been intimate before, but it always felt like she was holding something back. Not this time. She kissed me wildly, and in seconds, we were tearing at each other's clothes. Sharing a moment together in the back seat of the car wasn't the most comfortable experience, but it was definitely thrilling. We were both out of breath and laughing uncontrollably as we slowly came back down from the excitement. I quickly realized that the same effect the weekend had on me also resonated with Elise. It made her incredibly lively and affectionate, and we spent every moment we could together until I had to leave on Sunday. We spent the whole Christmas vacation doing pretty much the same thing, although finding the time and space for intimacy could be tricky. However, it wasn't all fun and games. The longer the holiday break continued, the more tension there was between us. Elise was so eager and quickly fell into the habit that I would subsequently wonder what she was doing when I was off at college. When we weren't getting high and being intimate, we were getting a little frustrated with each other, and I think we were probably headed for an inevitable breakup when fate intervened. I'd been back at college for the spring semester about a month when Elise called me. Upset. Her period had been late, and she had quietly gone to a clinic, where the doctor confirmed her worst fear. She was pregnant. Even though neither of us was particularly religious, we didn't believe in abortion. After talking about it, we decided to get married. Both sets of parents were not happy about it, and my dad, in particular, begged me not to go through with it. But I felt like it was the honorable thing to do. So in May 1983, we were married. Much later, after our daughter Mary was born, I worked out the timeline and realized Elise must have conceived around Christmas Day. With a wife and family to support, college wasn't an option for me. I got a job working for a drugstore as a stock clerk and part-time cashier. I couldn't have gotten that job under the same circumstances today, because I would never have passed a drug screen, but that wasn't standard practice back then. I soon showed an affinity for the job, and after 2 years, I was promoted to assistant store manager at another branch in town. In 1985, Elise gave me a son, Robert, and just a year later, we had our daughter, Allison. After that, Elise had her tubes tied, and we set about raising our family. Throughout this period, we enjoyed some good times, but nothing too wild. We'd smoke pot fairly regularly, and occasionally we'd indulge in some harder substances like cocaine, hash, or LSD. Elise liked how some of the drugs made her feel, and was enthusiastic whenever we got high, especially since it often led to intimate moments. However, as the kids grew older, I moved away from the harder drugs, and as I took on more responsibilities, I let them fade from my life. I thought Elise had done the same. Let me emphasize that I loved her throughout all of this, even if at times things got a little chaotic around the house. In the fall of 1989, when Allison was 3 and Robert was 4, Elise decided to go back to work. She found a job as a secretary for a modest-sized electrical contractor. At first, I didn't mind because it meant added income to support our growing family. But then I started to meet some of the people she was working with and began to get bad vibes, especially from the men there. To be blunt, a lot of them were rather unscrupulous, and a couple were known drug users. Then there was Elise's friend, Glenda, who worked there and had encouraged Elise to take the job. Glenda was married to Mitch, a low-level dealer, and the main person we turned to when we wanted to get drugs. They fought constantly and were always running around on each other. I even suspected they were involved in swinging, although I never got involved in that. Mitch was okay for the most part, but when he got deep into drinking, he could be quite a terror. So I didn't get too close to him. But Elise and Glenda became fast friends, so we spent a lot of time at their house. The first time I really thought something might be going on with Elise was that New Year's Eve when we went to a big party at Mitch and Glenda's. It was the usual year-end bash, filled with beer and smoke. I had been away from weed for about 6 weeks, so it hit me pretty hard. I was fine until just after midnight when the champagne started flowing. I drank a significant amount on top of a dozen or so beers, and I ended up feeling sick. I remember sitting outside on the driveway, feeling miserable in the cold. Elise finally found me after I had been out there for a while, and she brought me inside, laying me down in a bed where I quickly passed out. I must have been down for a couple of hours when one of their teenage daughters rustled me out of her room. I staggered into the den, looking for Elise, but she was nowhere in sight. I thought I heard muffled sounds from one of the back bedrooms, but I was too out of it to investigate further. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I found Elise asleep on the sofa. After that night, I vowed never to let myself get that way again. I had a good career going, and I could sense that society was moving away from accepting recreational drug use. As stories about the dangers of illegal drug use began circulating, I cut back on my drinking considerably and eventually gave up smoking weed altogether. I thought Elise was in it with me, but it became clear that she had just stopped using at home. The first real sign that things were changing came in the spring when Elise got a new haircut and returned as a blonde. I also noticed she was losing some of the weight she had gained after having the children, although I didn't see her following any particular diet or workout program. With her new look, she began to wear more revealing clothing. When I finally complained about it, she shrugged and said she wanted to look good. As spring turned to summer, she started going out with the girls a couple of nights a week after work and began coming home later and later. After many of her nights out, she tried to slip in quietly, showering as soon as she got home. With her extended absences, our intimacy practically disappeared, which concerned me at first, but later I was glad it had. In mid-July, she came home around 2 a.m., and I watched her while pretending to be asleep. I noticed she pulled off her dress and was shocked to realize she hadn't been wearing anything underneath. That was the first concrete sign that made me suspect she might be unfaithful. I confronted her about it the next morning, and she looked me straight in the eye and denied it, saying indignantly that she wasn't having an affair. But her attitude spoke volumes. She shifted the conversation to imply that I was the one being suspicious. I knew I had stayed faithful, even though some of the women who worked under me had made advances. I avoided those encounters, knowing they were a bad practice. It wasn't that I was so virtuous. Rather, I had always been more comfortable with Elise, and the thought of being with someone else was daunting. Our relationship had ups and downs, but as time went on, there was an increasing disconnect between us. Our intimacy became non-existent, and we stopped sharing the playful banter we once enjoyed. I found myself worrying about her late nights and her bloodshot eyes, which often carried the faint scent of marijuana. She pushed back against my concerns, reminding me that she was old enough to make her own choices and that I had introduced her to that lifestyle. By the end of September, I made a desperate effort to salvage our relationship. I caught Elise on a day off and asked her to sit down with me for a serious conversation. I expressed my concerns about her increased use of marijuana and my suspicion that she might be using harder drugs. I asked her if she still loved me and wanted to stay married. She looked at me tearfully and said she did. I laid out some conditions. I wanted her to quit her job, find something else, enter a rehab program, and for us to see a marriage counselor. I was willing to wipe the slate clean, but only if she met me halfway. "I don't know, Steve," she said. "I make good money there, and I like working there. They treat me well, and I'm definitely not going into any rehab. I understand if you don't want to continue, but I'm not ready to quit. I'm not a junkie or anything. I can handle it. She did agree to meet with a counselor, and we attended 2 sessions before she decided it was a waste of time and money. The pattern of erratic behavior resumed. I began following her to the bars she frequented after work, where she socialized with a mixed group of men and women. Some of the places she visited were questionable. I never stayed long enough to see if she went off to motels, as I had to get home to our children. A couple of times, I noticed her heading to the back of the bar toward the restrooms and staying longer than I thought was necessary. By December, I had gathered enough circumstantial evidence that I was ready to take the next step to obtain concrete proof. By then, our marriage felt like a joke. We were arguing constantly, and she was coming home late almost every night, looking as if she had been out all night. I was frustrated with Elise and her apparent pattern of lies and infidelities. More importantly, she had significantly shifted her role as a mother, spending her time partying while I handled most of the parenting. The children noticed the change, and I needed to understand what she was doing to plan my next move, whether there was hope for our marriage or if it was time to consider divorce. To begin, I went to my doctor for a routine checkup and requested a blood test to confirm I didn't have any sexually transmitted diseases and to show I was drug-free. Next, I quietly collected samples from our 3 children and sent them to a DNA lab in another state. I wanted to know definitively whether I was their biological father. Although DNA testing wasn't as advanced then as it is now, it was sufficient to establish paternity. I didn't think it would change my feelings for them. I loved them regardless, but legally, I needed to know for custody reasons if we divorced. Finally, I sought out the best divorce attorney in town and discussed my concerns with him. He agreed to take me on as a client and referred me to his private investigator. Lily Spradling was a woman in her early 40s who seemed to know everyone in town and their business. I explained what I wanted, and she accepted the case. It was already costing me a fortune, and I still didn't have any concrete evidence. The situation came to a head on Christmas Eve. Elise's company usually closed around 1 p.m. that day, hosting a party for the employees in their warehouse. I expected her to come home after a few hours of celebration, so we could do some last-minute shopping and prepare for Christmas morning. However, 6 p.m. came and went, followed by 9 p.m., with no sign of her. I started calling everywhere I could think of. Friends, hospitals, but she was nowhere to be found. I was furious. She didn't even have the decency to rein in her behavior on Christmas Eve. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard a car door slam and saw Elise stumbling up the walk to the house. When she noticed me standing there, her expression fell. She attempted to push past me, but I caught her, overwhelmed by the smell of alcohol and an unmistakable hint of something else. I could see she was disoriented, as if she'd spent the day indulging. I stared at her, and she averted her gaze. In that moment, something inside me broke. I was too exhausted to fight her. Besides, I would soon have video evidence of her day. I had a feeling she would engage in behavior that warranted proof, so I had arranged for Lily to set up surveillance. By then, Lily had discovered that Elise had been seen at a questionable motel on the rough side of town with some unsavory characters. She had bribed a clerk at the motel to allow her to plant a hidden camera in one of the rooms. The plan was for Elise and her companion to be directed to that specific room if they showed up. Elise and I spent a tense Christmas day circling each other, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. It was the calm before the storm. I knew Elise was off work for the next week. They always closed up for the week between Christmas and New Year's, so I wasn't as worried about what she'd be doing the day after Christmas. Lily called me at the store, and her voice sounded urgent. "You need to come see the tape from the other day," she said. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Worse than anything you can imagine," she replied. I figured Elise had a boyfriend, maybe 2, but I was not prepared at all for what I saw on Lily's surveillance tape. Lily had me sit down in the empty office of one of her associates, plugged the tape into the VCR, and left me alone to digest what was on the tape. Before she started, she handed me a surveillance report chronicling Elise's behavior prior to her arrival at the motel, which was pretty graphic in itself. It started off as a conventional party. Lots of drinking, some playful interactions under the mistletoe. Nothing too dramatic. After an hour, though, the Christmas carols on the boombox were replaced by dance music, and Elise was seen dancing provocatively with several people, including her friend Glenda. According to the report, Elise and Glenda were caught up in the moment while the men in attendance surrounded them, cheering them on. Then things escalated. Elise was seen heading out to the parking lot with a guy. The private investigator set up a post where he could see what they were doing. First, they lit up a joint, and while they were smoking, he pulled out a vial, and they shared several lines of cocaine. When they finished, the investigator noted Elise leaning into the man's lap, and he could see the man's expression of pleasure. A few minutes later, Elise's head popped back up, and she was wiping something from her mouth with a mischievous smile. They returned to the party, and around 5 o'clock, it broke up. But instead of driving home, Elise followed several pickup trucks to the motel where she had been seen before. And that's where the tape started. My wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, entered the room with 4 men, who I would describe as rugged-looking. They were all around 6 feet tall and well-built, with a couple of them being fairly attractive, if you liked a rough edge. 3 joints were lit and made the rounds while one of the men sat at a table, preparing several lines of cocaine. As the room filled with smoke, everyone, including Elise, participated, and she laughed enticingly after doing hers. Then they got down to business. What I saw on the tape was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Her performance was shockingly uninhibited, surpassing anything I had ever seen before. I had seen enough, but I fast-forwarded through the tape to grasp how far it had escalated. By then, I was numb to any further shock. So when she was with all 4 of them at once, it hardly registered. I guess the look on my face spoke volumes because Lily had her associate, the one who followed Elise at the party, take me to a nearby bar for a drink. After a couple of beers with a guy named Burl, I felt a little better. We talked about my plans, and he agreed to help me when it came time to serve Elise with divorce papers. He turned out to be a big, muscular fellow, but a softy inside, understanding my situation since he had been through something similar. That night, when I went home, it took everything I had to be civil to Elise. Luckily, she made it easy for me by getting dressed up and going out with her friends. I didn't even bother to watch her leave. I was busy playing with our daughter Allison in the den when she walked out. The next morning, I went to my lawyer and told him I was ready to file the papers. I'd wanted them ready for New Year's Eve, and I wanted Burl to be the one to serve her. I had a surprise planned for my soon-to-be ex-wife that night. I told Elise that I would have to work until closing at 9 p.m., and that I preferred to spend a quiet night at home. I begged her to stay with me, fully aware she would not, as she was planning to attend Glenda and Mitch's party. She laughed at what she perceived as my pathetic attempt to guilt her into staying home. "If you want to be a stick in the mud, go right ahead," she said, "but I'm ready to party. Can't you at least stay long enough to keep the kids until I get home from work?" I asked. "Why?" she sneered. "Why should I let the little rugrats cut into my fun time? I'll get a sitter if you can't tear yourself away from that store in time." I was stunned. I knew she had lost interest in parenting, but the cold way she talked about our children floored me. It made what subsequently happened hard to fathom. "That's quite all right, Elise," I said slowly. "I'll make the arrangements. You don't have to worry about the kids one little bit." I called the neighbor's teenage daughter, who was the kids' regular sitter, and asked her to watch the kids for about an hour. She agreed, and I told her to call the store as soon as Elise left the house. A little after 6:30, the girl called, and I turned over the store to my assistant. I called my brother, who had agreed to meet me at the house to help pack up Elise's things. His wife drove him over and left with my children, who were told they were going to spend the night with their grandparents. We packed up all of Elise's belongings and moved them in my pickup truck to a storage facility. Then we drove to Mitch and Glenda's a little after 10 o'clock. Burl was sitting in his car in a secure location, watching the house. "She hasn't left," Burl said. "It's a pretty safe bet she's there for the night." "Good," I replied, as he poured me a cup of coffee from a thermos he had with him. We watched the house as several people came and went until midnight. As the sounds of fireworks erupted all around us, the three of us got out and approached the house. At first, no one answered the door, probably because they couldn't hear over the noise. But Burl pounded on the door, and finally, someone I didn't know opened it. Elise Moreland. He boomed as we stepped into the foyer. It took a few minutes before someone could fetch her, and she looked pretty disheveled when she showed up. "Yeah. What?" she began, then saw me and my brother standing on either side of Burl, and I think our expressions made it clear we weren't there to join the party. "What are you?" She started again, but Burl cut her off. "Elise Moreland," he said, slapping one of the papers he had with him into her hand. "You were served. This is a petition filed in civil court by Mr. Steve Moreland, seeking the divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. This is an injunction from the court preventing you from coming within 1,500 feet of the residence formerly occupied by you and your husband. And this envelope contains the key and the address to a storage facility where your belongings have been moved," he added. "You sorry son of a—" Elise sputtered. I could see Mitch, Glenda, and all of their friends starting to gather behind her. "I gave you a chance, Elise," I said evenly. "I gave you the opportunity to clean up your act, and you chose not to. You've made your bed. Now lie in it." We heard a cacophony of outrage building, so Burl opened his jacket to reveal the pistol in his belt. He put his hand on the handle and stared down the crowd. Then we turned and strode purposefully out of the house as the door slammed shut behind us. I doubted Burl would have used his pistol, but it served as an effective deterrent. Then I went to my parents' house to spend what was left of New Year's Eve and prepared myself for the battle to come. It wasn't long in coming. The truth is, Elise started causing trouble right from the beginning, and it was the start of a tumultuous year. While we had been packing up her things, I had hired a locksmith to change the locks on our house, but that didn't stop Elise. While we were spending New Year's Day at my parents' house, she broke a window in the kitchen door to get inside and apparently ransacked our bedroom. Perhaps she was looking for something, I'm not sure. It didn't matter. I called the police and had her charged with breaking and entering. Since it was her first arrest, and it was done in conjunction with my serving her the night before, her lawyer managed to get the charges dropped. A week later, I got my blood work back from the doctor and breathed a sigh of relief when everything came back negative. I added those documents to my growing evidence file, then received more good news the following week. The DNA results revealed that all three of the kids were indeed mine. Whatever Elise had done behind my back had started after the babies were born, which made my strategy clear. I was going for full custody and would only allow Elise supervised visitation. To my bafflement, she fought me tooth and nail. I would have thought that given her behavior, she'd be glad to have her freedom and would welcome not having a husband and family holding her back. However, I hadn't accounted for the demons my father had seen lurking in her heart all those years earlier. I became an enemy in her eyes. She wasn't about to let me win anything without a fight. Yet it seemed that the more she tried to resist, the worse things got for her, which only fueled her anger towards me. This included another arrest for possession of marijuana, which resulted in a hefty fine and a 6-month suspension of her driver's license. By midsummer, I finally got the divorce I'd been seeking. We then went to court for the custody issue, where she brought out what she thought was her heavy artillery: the fact that I had introduced her to drugs. My lawyer countered with my evidence that I was drug-free and had been for the better part of a year. It looked like I was going to get full custody when Elise finally crossed the line. It was a hot night in September when I was just leaving the store. The only warning I received was a sudden shuffling of several pairs of feet, and then I felt a hard hit in my ribs. Something large, maybe a stick or a baseball bat. I barely managed to roll away from a blow aimed at my head, which glanced off my shoulder. I got to my knees to defend myself and realized I was being attacked by 3 assailants, 2 of whom I recognized from a video of Elise's Christmas Eve party. I engaged the one wielding the weapon, preventing him from landing a solid blow on me, and managed to hit him in the midsection. However, that left me vulnerable to the fists and feet of the other 2. I'm not sure if they would have killed me, but I vaguely heard voices coming from down the street before I collapsed in pain. The last thing I remember was a kid hovering over me, asking if I was okay and calling for someone to get help. The next thing I saw was a woman's face. At first, it was vague, but as my head cleared, I recognized her as a nurse, a very pretty one at that. She had a slender face and smiled brightly when she saw I was coming around, which lit up her entire expression. That was my introduction to Grace Pauling. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, during which time I got to know Grace very well. She was quite simply the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, aptly named for her graceful presence and elegance that stemmed from an inner peace. A little taller than average and quite slender, she had soft blonde hair styled just short of her shoulders. She was flat-chested, but if that bothered her at all, she didn't show it, and it certainly didn't bother me. From the beginning, I sensed a connection between us, and we talked while she busied herself caring for me. I found her to be a terrific listener, wise beyond her years. She was a year or so older than me, had never been married, and hadn't really come close to it. She mentioned having had a few boyfriends, but none that had made her heart race. Then she smiled that radiant smile and winked at me. While I was in the hospital, I met with the police several times, and it became clear that I had been attacked at the behest of my ex-wife, for reasons I couldn't fully understand. She and her friends were arrested and charged with attempted murder. I let her sweat it out until the beginning of the next year, then proposed a deal. If she relinquished all custody claims, I would see about getting the charges reduced to aggravated assault. "Why should I help you?" she snarled. "Because I really don't think you want to spend the next 15 years in prison," I said. "I'm giving you the choice between 3 to 6 years, with the possibility of occasionally seeing your children, or 15 years to life, with no chance of seeing them again. Don't be as foolish as you were when you rejected my offer to save our marriage. Remember, I would have overlooked everything you had done up to that point if you had followed my advice. If you had quit that job, gone into rehab, and been serious about counseling, none of this would have happened, but you declined. Where did that get you? You're unemployed, struggling with addiction, and now you're about to become a convicted felon." "You haven't got anything on me," she shot back. "Oh, really?" I sneered, no longer willing to be her doormat. "You should hear the stories your friends are telling. They're saying you hired them to attack me. They're telling the cops you wanted me dead. They're turning against you, Elise, and your only chance now is to cut a deal." I could see her shoulders slump at that. In the end, she agreed and made a deal with the DA to plead guilty to aggravated assault. She was sentenced to 3 to 6 years, and I was finally rid of her for all intents and purposes. However, it left me financially drained and emotionally exhausted. I had to sell the house and move back to my parents' home with the 3 kids. My mom was a godsend, helping care for them and trying her best to ease their fears. After getting out of the hospital, I underwent another 2 months of rehab, during which time I couldn't work. I was on company insurance and received workers' compensation, but with the Christmas season approaching, they needed a store manager on site. Compared to the fiasco of the previous year, Christmas in 1991 was significantly better, yet it drove home just how lonely I was. The woman I had once loved, the mother of my children, had become a sworn enemy and completely wrecked her life. Money was tight, and I struggled to provide for the kids as I wanted. I was still in pain and sinking into depression over how things had unfolded in the past 18 months. Then, after the first of the year, the company I had been working for gave me a choice. I could take a manager's position in another state or accept a layoff. I chose neither. Instead, I tendered my resignation and found a job working on the floor of a large retail store. It was a significant downgrade from my previous position, and I made considerably less than before. Essentially, it felt like starting over in my career, but the work was easy, and the hours suited me, allowing me to be home in the evenings with my children. I rented a small house and moved out of my parents' home. It was in a low-rent neighborhood, and there wasn't much to call home. Overall, that winter of 1992 was the lowest point of my life. The only positive aspect was that I resisted the temptation of drugs and alcohol. After witnessing Elise's self-destruction, I knew better than to go down that path. But I would be lying if I said I was never tempted. Then, an angel crossed my path for the second time. One Saturday, I was in the grocery store with the kids, who were being a handful. By this time, they were 8, 6, and 5. While they were good kids, they were still kids. I was fussing with Robert, who was really acting out, when I heard a voice from behind me. Steve Moreland, I heard, and turned to see Grace approaching us. We hugged in greeting, and then she bent down to greet all 3 children by name. I was amazed. She had only met them once or twice, yet she knew their names and ages. That was the first time I saw how gifted she was with children, as they instantly calmed down. We chatted, and she expressed real concern about how I was doing. Then we both looked up at the same time, and our eyes locked for a moment. In that instant, I think we both felt the spark. "Would you like to go to dinner sometime?" I asked hesitantly. "Well, I owe you for all the care you showed me when I was hospitalized," Grace said, "but I have to admit it was a pleasure, and I'd love to go out with you. Do you have any plans for tonight?" I just stared at her, and later, when I got to know her better, I learned that this was her way, very direct and able to get straight to the point without unnecessary small talk. We exchanged phone numbers, and then she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. It was nothing significant, but it sent shivers through my body, and my daughter Allison picked up on it right away. As we finished our shopping, she blurted out, "Is she going to be our new mommy?" "Oh, I don't know, sweetheart," I replied. "It's way too early to say." "Why? Would you like her to be your new mommy?" "Oh, yes," she said happily. "What about you two?" I asked Mary and Robert. "Do you think you could accept Miss Grace as your new mommy?" "Sure, Dad," Robert said. "She's pretty neat." "Well, we'll see," I laughed, but added, "It's awfully early, and she may have something to say about it. But you do like her, don't you?" I asked Mary, who replied in her typical quiet voice, "Yeah, I do. But like I said, we've got a long way to go before we get to that point." That night, I took Grace to a steakhouse. Not fancy, but with a good atmosphere and great food. I learned that she was everything Elise was not. I can't say Grace is perfect. She has her moments, but I've never met anyone with such a sunny disposition or such a positive outlook on life. With Elise, there was always doom and gloom lurking around every corner. She spent endless energy worrying about things beyond her control, dragging me down with her. With Grace, every day is a new opportunity. She is a forward-looking person, well-organized, and never wastes a moment worrying about the past. Once the day is over, she puts it behind her and only refers to it when absolutely necessary. It didn't take long before we knew we were falling in love. After about 6 weeks of dating, I took her to meet my family, and they were very impressed. My father took one look at her and told me to do whatever it took to keep her. The kids, of course, fell in love with Grace almost as quickly as I did, and she seamlessly stepped into the role of surrogate mother. As the summer progressed, we began getting closer, but we were both cautious about taking that next step. After my experiences with Elise, I was afraid to let my feelings loose. Grace, on the other hand, expressed her desire for intimacy with meaning. "When I make love with you, I want it to be a seal of our bond," she told me one night while we sat on the sofa in my home after dinner. "It's mid-November, and we're starting to talk vaguely about a life together. I love you, Steve, But I don't want to rush into anything until we're both ready for a long-term commitment," she continued. "I gave my virginity away a long time ago in college to someone I thought I loved, and he broke my heart. Since then, I've waited for the right man. I believe you could be that man, but until you're ready to take that final step, it won't happen." Grace, I want you so badly," I admitted. "But it makes me feel good to hear you say that. After what I went through with Elise, to hear a woman equate intimacy with love is music to my ears." "Soon, my love," she whispered, then kissed me softly. A week later, I went to my mother and told her I was going to ask Grace to marry me. She did something she had never done for Elise. I guess because of the forced nature of our marriage, she went to her bedroom and pulled out her old engagement ring. With tears in her eyes, she handed it to me. "Give this to her with my blessing," she said. "It's not a big fancy diamond, just a small stone in a simple setting. But I have a feeling it will mean far more to her than some shiny new bauble that will cost you an arm and a leg. There's a lot of love in this ring, and I want her to have it. She's the best thing that's ever happened to you, and I want her to know it." I decided to wait until Christmas Eve to propose. We would celebrate with Santa Claus at my parents' house, where the kids would be with their cousins and grandparents. I wanted to have some time alone with Grace that night. I picked her up from the hospital after I got off work, then went to my parents to collect the kids for the Christmas Eve service at the church, where Grace had long been a member and where I had started going. Grace sang in the choir, and I gazed lovingly into her eyes as she performed. Afterward, we managed to get the kids settled down, which wasn't easy, and then set out the Santa gifts. Once that was done, I told my parents we were heading back to my house, winking at my mom to communicate my plans non-verbally. I turned on the lights on the Christmas tree and put some holiday tunes on the stereo. Then we sat down on the sofa together, and I eased the box from where I'd hidden it in the cushions. "Grace, I have a special Christmas gift for you, and I want you to open it now," I said softly. I handed the box to her, and when she opened it, her eyes widened in delighted surprise. "Grace, will you marry me?" Her answer was to embrace me tightly, showering me with affectionate kisses. Our hands found their way to each other, and this time we didn't stop. The moment felt right. I've wanted this for so long." "Love me, Steve," she whispered. "Please believe me. I've wanted it just as long, longer." "Really?" We shared a deep gaze, feelings flowing between us without words. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered. "Merry Christmas to you, love," I answered back. Grace and I were married in our church in mid-March, and we've enjoyed almost 14 years of happiness together. My children soon came to see her as their new mother, and they adapted to her presence as if it were second nature. There have only been 2 significant challenges in our life together since then. The first was that Grace was unable to have a child of her own. We tried everything we could, only to learn that there was a problem with her uterus. Typically, Grace never dwelled on her misfortune and focused on helping me raise the children we had. The second challenge arose about 6 years into our marriage. I received an unexpected call from Elise, who told me that she had contracted HIV several years earlier and was now facing the final stages of AIDS. After spending over 3 years in prison, she had found herself on the streets and in a hospice, wanting to see her children before she passed. I dreaded the visit, but surprisingly, Elise had made peace with herself and with me. She no longer blamed me for the difficulties in her life and forgave me for the mistakes I'd made during our marriage. I, in turn, forgave her for the pain she caused me during our divorce. After meeting with the kids, Elise asked to speak to Grace alone. When Grace emerged, she was in tears. Later, as we drove home, she shared some details of their conversation. "She told me not to let you go," Grace said. "She said the worst mistake she ever made was not listening to you when you offered to save the marriage. She knows she blew it by turning her back on you." I realized that this bitterness had been a weight on Elise throughout her life. The last thing Elise did before she died was consent for Grace to adopt the children. She had resisted this for years, But in the end, she made the right choice and allowed the love of my life to truly be a mother. With Grace by my side, I quickly returned to management and advanced in the corporate office. I'm now a regional director for the company, and I've done well. Grace continues her work as a nurse in pediatrics, where her special gifts are most needed. Sometimes, the cases she handles break her heart, while others ignite her passion for justice. Although she has a temper, she keeps it well hidden. Mary was so inspired by her stepmother that she chose to follow in her footsteps and pursue a career in nursing. Robert is still in college and joined the Army National Guard right after high school. I worry that the longer the war in Iraq drags on, the more likely he may be called up. But that's his choice, and I support him all the way. Likewise, Allison is in college with an eye toward becoming a teacher. It's been a satisfying life, one I don't think I would have had if Grace hadn't come into my life when she did. Santa Claus is all set out, and Grace sits on the sofa next to me, curling up into the comfort of my arms. Bing Crosby softly croons "White Christmas" from the stereo as we gaze into the slowly banked fire. I take a final sip from my glass and set it on the coffee table. Tomorrow, there will be laughter and excitement as my family shares the gifts we've all gotten for each other. We'll tear open the packages and marvel at the thought that went into each gift. Then we'll congregate in the kitchen as we prepare the holiday feast. It will be a joyous time, as always, but tonight, in the quiet of Christmas Eve, I enjoy the greatest gift I've ever received, the one that keeps on giving. Tonight, I bask in the soft glow from the love and devotion of a good woman, and in the corresponding love and commitment I've been able to show her over time. Grace is another word for elegance and an unearned gift from God. And that's certainly what my Grace means to me. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.